There is a mask hanging behind the plot of early book 1 of Avatar, The Last Airbender. Black lacquer, cold blue paint, a permanent snarl carved into the wood, and for one entire episode, nobody watching has the faintest idea that Prince Zuko is the one breathing behind it. That part of the trick you can work out on a rewatch, once you know what to look for. The part almost nobody catches is that the mask itself is hiding a second secret, something the creators chose on purpose and later admitted to. And we will get to exactly what that colour used to be and why it changed. Tonight, we are going through every fight this show staged that actually mattered, from a small scuffle over a stolen scroll of waterbending forms, all the way up to the 2 battles that nearly every published ranking of this show agrees belong at the very top. And we are doing it in order, worst to best, with the reasoning laid out as we go. So get comfortable, we will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. Before the countdown starts, it is worth saying plainly what best means here, because Avatar, The Last Airbender, ran for 3 books, 61 episodes, and staged something like 24 fights worth talking about, and no 2 people would rank them the same way. Ranker has crowd-voted lists. Screen Rant has published its own top 10. CBR has run separate rankings for each book, plus a most creative list and a most evenly matched list. They agree on almost nothing except the very top, which we will get to. This countdown uses one blended standard, stated up front, rather than pretended into objectivity, how much the fight actually mattered to the story, how ambitious the animation was for the studios working on it at the time, how evenly matched the 2 sides were, rather than one side simply winning, and what changed afterward, in the world or in a character, because of it. There is no attempt here to pretend this is the only correct order, only the most honest one this particular set of standards can produce, applied consistently from the smallest skirmish to the largest. Where the published rankings above line up with that standard, we will say so. Where they do not, we will say that too. Part of what makes ranking fights in this particular show harder than it sounds is how rarely the story treats any single confrontation as a stand-alone event worth judging on choreography alone. Almost every fight on this list is doing at least 2 jobs at once, advancing the plot in front of the camera and revealing something about a character that the writers were not willing to just say out loud in dialogue, which means a fight that looks unremarkable on the surface can still end up mattering enormously to where that character stands 3 episodes later. And a fight that looks spectacular in the moment can occasionally turn out to be mostly decoration once the season is over. This countdown has tried to weigh both sides of that honestly, rather than defaulting to whichever surface simply reads more exciting on a first watch. Knowing what these people were working with while they made it goes a long way. By most accounts, something that surprises a lot of viewers who assume the series sailed smoothly from premiere to finale. After book 2, Nickelodeon did not pick it up right away. The ratings were not strong enough. He has his own words, were blunt about it. The writing staff was reportedly let go for a stretch of months, an actual gap where nobody was being paid to write the next season of a show. Most of us now consider one of the best written things Nickelodeon ever aired, and as the story is usually told, it took a network executive pushing internally to bring book 3 back at all. Even once that happened, the crew ran staggered hiatuses just to let the scripts catch up to the animation schedule. Every fight in the back half of this show, the Boiling Rock, the Eclipse Invasion, the entire finale, was written by a staff that had already been sent home once. Mark Hamill, who voices Fire Lord Ozai, has said something in the same vein that lands differently. Once you know the show, almost did not survive its own second year. He has said he read the first script and figured it would get cancelled almost right away, because it was too smart, because it talked up to children instead of talking down to them. He was wrong about the cancellation timing, but only barely, and only because someone at the network fought for it after the fact. The animation itself was a real international effort, and it is worth knowing the shape of that before we start ranking fight choreography, because the animation got more ambitious as the series went on, is a claim you can actually check against who was doing the drawing. JM Animation, a Korean studio that had been around for years by the time the series started, handled a large share of the series episodes across all 3 books, working alongside Dr. Movie and later Moy Animation. When this countdown credits a specific fight's choreography to a specific storyboard artist or a specific studio, that credit is coming from the show's own DVD commentary and the official artbook, not a guess. Because a script like this one lives or dies on getting that kind of detail right, rather than sounding right. So here is the order. A long run of fights, worst to best, starting with the ones that mattered least to the overall story, and building toward the 2 that, whichever outlet you check, keep landing at the very top. One fight sits outside the numbered list entirely, and it is worth pausing on for a moment before the countdown proper begins, because it is the very first thing this show ever asks a viewer to sit through. In the 2-part premiere, a Fire Nation ship commanded by a still teenage Prince Zuko chases the beam of light that shoots into the sky when Aang breaks free of the iceberg, and only pinpoints the southern water tribe village where Katara and Sokka live after the 2 of them stumble into a hidden trap aboard a derelict Fire Nation vessel nearby. Zuko's soldiers move on the village, and Aang, barely a day out of 100 years frozen in ice, holds his own against Zuko in an airbending duel before surrendering himself to keep the villagers safe, only to break free of his captors later and escape aboard Appa with Katara and Sokka. This one does not make the rank list, because almost nothing about it is a real contest. A handful of Fire Nation soldiers against one airbender who does not yet fully understand what he can do, and a village that has already lost every waterbender capable of fighting back. But it sets the terms for every single fight that follows it. The Fire Nation as an occupying force that shows up uninvited, Aang as someone whose power outstrips his control of it, and Zuko, in his very first appearance, already defined by the exact single-minded hunt that will drive nearly every choice he makes for the next 2 full seasons. Everything on the list that follows is, in some sense, still answering the question this opening skirmish first asks. A village attacked before it ever did anything to provoke that attack. A boy discovering his own power before anyone has taught him what to do with it. Prince already certain of exactly what he wants and how far he is willing to go to get it. Watching it again, after knowing everything that eventually happens to Zuko, is a strange experience, since the show gives him almost no interiority here. Just a young man barking orders at soldiers older than him, desperate enough for his father's approval to chase a myth across the poles of the world, and it will be nearly a full season before we understand why. Katara and Sokka get the opposite treatment in this same opening, thrown straight into a crisis with almost no setup at all, which is exactly the pace this show keeps for its entire run. Character explained through pressure rather than exposition, starting on page 1 and never really letting up. Number 24 is the 3-way skirmish over the waterbending scroll, early in book 1, when Katara steals a scroll of bending forms from a crew of river pirates, and Zuko, independently hunting the Avatar, strikes a deal with those same pirates to help him capture Aang. Once the pirates figure out who Aang actually is, the fight turns into 3 factions, grabbing at each other at once. Zuko's crew, the pirates, and Team Avatar, before Aang and Katara waterbend the pirates' own ship out from under them and escape. It is a fun scene, briskly paced, and it does real character work, since it is the first time we see Katara willing to bend the rules to get what she wants, and the first time the show lets Zuko's competence look almost comic rather than threatening. But nothing here changes the shape of the story. Nobody is hurt in any lasting way, no alliance shifts, no piece of information moves that the plot needed. There is a pleasure in watching a fight like this, precisely because it does not matter. 3 groups of people who each want the same object for a completely different reason, scrambling over each other on a moving deck with none of the weight the series will start loading onto every other confrontation from here on. It earns its place on this list, and it earns the bottom of it. And honestly, it should. Not every fight in a show this long needs to be a referendum on someone's soul. Even here though, it cannot resist a small character beat. Zuko's crew treating the whole detour as beneath them, visibly embarrassed to be negotiating with pirates at all. A tiny flash of the disciplined military unit they are supposed to be underneath Zuko's increasingly frantic command. 23 is the Fire Nation assault on the Northern Air Temple, where a Fire Nation weapons envoy under a war minister named Kin attacks the temple, now home to Earth Kingdom refugees, and a self-taught engineer everyone calls the Mechanist. Once the arms deal between them collapses, soldiers and Tundra tanks push in, and Sokka and the Mechanist respond with the first working prototype of what will eventually become the Fire Nation's own war balloon, using it to ignite a pocket of natural gas and force a retreat. That prototype is a clever piece of improvised engineering under pressure, and it is also, structurally, a trap the show sets for itself, because the Fire Nation recovers that same balloon technology afterward and turns it into the airship fleet Sokka, Suki and Toph will eventually have to destroy near the end of the series. That long-range consequence is what lifts it off the very bottom of this list. As a fight on its own terms though, it is fairly straightforward siege and repel material. Tundra tanks grinding forward through the snow, refugees scrambling to defend a home they only just finished rebuilding out of the ruins of an actual air temple. Memorable mostly for the idea inside it, rather than the choreography. What stays with me about this one is not the battle itself, but the shape of the trade, a piece of Fire Nation weapons technology handed over almost accidentally by the good guys in the act of saving themselves, and then turned back against the rest of the world within the very same season. This show does that more than once, letting a victory carry a cost that only becomes visible several episodes later, and this is the first time it tries the trick. 22 is the return to Amashu, where Aang tries to trade a captured Fire Nation governor's son for the imprisoned King Bumi, only for Princess Azula to interfere in the exchange. Team Avatar frees Bumi in the process, and then Bumi, in one of the stranger character choices in the entire series, chooses to stay a prisoner rather than leave with them, telling Aang to go find an earthbending teacher who waits and listens. A piece of advice that is really the writers quietly pointing toward Toph 3 episodes before she exists on screen. As a fight, this one is more about tension and manoeuvring than sustained combat. Azula's introduction as a live threat rather than an abstract one, but its real value is structural rather than kinetic, setting up both Bumi's eventual role in the final season and the entire earthbending arc still to come. It also lets the series reintroduce a character it had mostly played for comic relief in Book 1 as something stranger and sadder than that first impression suggested. A king who has apparently decided that losing on his own terms serves the war effort better than being rescued does, which is an odd thing for an animated show aimed at children, to let a supporting character choose and mean. Bumi's advice about a teacher who waits and listens pays off almost immediately in a fight worth pausing on here, even though it does not carry a number of its own on this list, since it is closer to a sporting match than a battle with any actual danger behind it. Aang and his friends stumble into an underground earthbending tournament called Earth Rumble, and its reigning, undefeated champion, fighting under a mask as the Blind Bandit, turns out to be a small blind girl named Toph, who has spent years hiding an extraordinary gift from parents who see her only as fragile. She beats a much larger opponent, a wrestler the show calls the Boulder, without much visible effort, and when Aang challenges her directly afterward, curious whether an airbender's aerial style can beat someone who reads the world through vibration in the ground, he wins by staying entirely off the earth she can sense, knocking her clean out of the ring from above in what the series frames as close to her only loss in a very long, very dominant run as champion. The sequence is properly fun, playful in a way the war-scale fights on this list rarely get to be, and it matters enormously for what comes after it, since it is the fight that convinces Toph to walk away from her parents' house and join Team Avatar as Aang's own earthbending teacher. It does not rank on the numbered list, because nothing here is actually a fight for survival. No soldiers, no stakes beyond pride, and a title belt in an illegal fighting pit. But skipping it entirely would leave out the moment this show's most beloved character actually arrives. 21 is the Kyoshi warriors defending their island against a Fire Nation raiding party led by Zuko. Early in Book 1, Suki and her warriors, fighting alongside Sokka, spring an ambush on the raiding party searching for the Avatar, and manage to knock Zuko clean off the Komodo rhino he is riding, though he answers with his own firebending and gets the better of them before the fight moves on. What makes this one worth a real look rather than a passing mention is where the Kyoshi warriors' fighting style actually comes from. Most of the bending and non-bending combat in this show is built on Chinese martial arts traditions, brought in by martial arts consultant Sifuki Su, but the Kyoshi warriors are a specific exception. Their fan work is grounded in Tessenjutsu, a real Japanese war fan fighting art, layered onto samurai-influenced armour, which makes them one of the only combat traditions in an otherwise heavily Chinese-coded world, built specifically on a Japanese source instead. That is a small, world-building choice most viewers never register consciously, but it is exactly the kind of research-driven specificity that separates this show's fight design from a lot of its contemporaries. The fight itself, though, functions mostly as an introduction, a way to establish Suki and the island before either matters to the larger plot, which is why it sits this low. Sokka's own arc gets a quiet head start here as well. A boy who spends this episode dismissive of the Kyoshi warriors, purely because they are women, humbled fast enough by Suki that his attitude toward every capable woman he meets afterward, Katara included, noticeably softens. I like this one more than its ranking suggests, if I'm being honest, mostly for the image of it. Warriors in white and gold face paint, dropping a prince twice their size off the back of a rhino in under a minute. But a good image is not the same thing as a fight with weight behind it, and this list has to keep those two things separate. Number 20 is Sokka's duel against the Master Swordsman Piandao in Book 3, and this is the first entry on the list that is really about a character rather than about the war. Piandao takes Sokka on as a student, and it turns out he has known all along, just from Sokka's own name, that the boy is a warrior from the Southern Water Tribe rather than a Fire Nation noble, training him anyway until Sokka finally confesses the truth himself, and Piandao insists on a real duel as a last test of what he can do. Sokka loses, but he loses well, using the high ground and a stand of collapsing bamboo to make the fight far harder than Piandao expects, and by then the blade is already his. Forged earlier in the same episode from the meteorite Team Avatar, hauled back to the estate, the sword he carries into the finale, now proven worthy in his hands. There is a nice piece of behind-the-scenes symmetry buried in this one. Sifuki Su did not just choreograph the fight, he was also the physical and character design reference for Piandao himself, and the swords both Sokka and Piandao carry on screen were modelled directly on real swords Kisu owned. A small detail, but it means the master teaching Sokka swordsmanship in the show is, in a very literal design sense, modelled on the actual swordsman, teaching the animators how to draw swordsmanship. And since we are talking about Sokka's weapons here, it is worth mentioning something fans have actually gone back and tallied from the series itself. Across every episode, Sokka's boomerang lands its throw with what amounts to a near perfect record, missing only once in the entire series, which is more than enough to justify the in-universe nickname it eventually earns. Boomerang, trusted enough to get its own, aside from the characters who use it. None of that changes the outcome of the war, but it is the first fight on this list that is really about who a character is, rather than what is at stake around them, and that is worth more than a clean skirmish with nothing behind it. Sokka rarely gets treated by the fandom with the same reverence as the series benders, and this duel is a decent argument for why that undersells him. A non-bender losing on pure technical merit to an acknowledged master and still walking away with something to show for it. That closes out the tier of fights that mostly exist to establish who someone is before the story asks anything harder of them. A prince proving he can already win a duel, a girl proving she is not a lost cause, a warrior proving she does not need to be a bender to hold a line. From here the fights start costing something. Reputations get damaged, identities get exposed, and more than one character has to choose between winning and being seen for who they actually are. Number 19 brings in a character who does not get a name for most of his own screen time. In the Book 3 episode, The Runaway, a masked assassin hired by Zuko to track the Avatar shows up for the first time, and Sokka, on the spot, dubs him Sparky Boom Man, a name Aang immediately borrows in the scramble that follows, before the writers eventually settle on the far more efficient Combustion Man for his later appearances. Toph is the one who actually handles him here. He hurls a boulder to cover their escape, and when he blasts it apart himself, a single stray pebble from the wreckage catches him directly on the tattoo covering his forehead, which turns out to be the literal focal point of his bending. The blast nearly turns back on him. The fight only ends when Sokka's boomerang strikes the assassin's third eye, sending his own combustion blast back onto himself and taking him out for good. Short as it is, this fight would not rank especially high on its own, but it plants something the show is patient enough to pay off properly later, and we will get back to that payoff further up this list. What sells the whole sequence is how casually Toph treats what should be a terrifying first encounter with someone who can level a building. A pebble, almost an afterthought. The kind of quiet confidence the series has been building toward across her entire introduction as a fighter. 18 is the Blue Spirit Rescue, and this is where we come back to the mask from the opening of this video. Zuko, working entirely alone and in disguise, infiltrates a Fire Nation stronghold called Powai to pull Aang out of Commander Zhao's custody, not out of mercy, but because he wants the Avatar for himself. He and Aang fight and escape together, at one point using a pair of assault ladders as makeshift stilts to get past a wall, and it plays, for most of its runtime, like the two of them are unlikely allies rather than enemies. Then, Aang unmasks him, recognises him, and offers him friendship outright, and Zuko, once he has recovered enough to think straight again, attacks him anyway, and Aang has to flee the same person who just saved him. That whiplash, gratitude curdling into hostility inside the space of a single scene, is what makes this fight linger longer than its runtime deserves. A brief glimpse of a version of these two characters who might have actually gotten along, snatched away the instant Zuko remembers what he is supposed to want. Now, about that mask. Bryan Konietzko has said the Blue Spirit was originally designed red, and he was the one who changed it to blue. For two reasons that both hold up once you think about them. A red mask made Zuko look, in his own description, a bit like an ancient Korean version of Spider-Man, and red is so tightly bound to Fire Nation identity throughout the rest of the show that keeping the mask red risked giving away exactly who was under it before the story wanted you to know. The mask even seems to pick up a piece of in-world history years later in one of the comics, where Zuko's mother, Ursa, is shown admiring a wall of theatre masks that fans believe includes this exact one, tied to a stage. Place some connect to Love Amongst the Dragons, said to represent an evil water spirit. None of that backstory exists yet at the point this episode airs. All of it gets folded in retroactively once the comics start filling in the gaps the series left open, which is worth knowing if you ever hear someone claim the mask's meaning was planned from the start. 17 is Zuko alone, and structurally this is one of the more unusual entries on the list, because the fight itself is almost the least important part of the episode, travelling through the Earth Kingdom on his own, stripped of his crew and his uncle both. Zuko bonds with a boy named Lee, and ends up defending Lee's family and their village from a band of rogue soldiers led by an earthbender the show calls Gao. Zuko wins by firebending in front of the entire village, which is exactly the problem, because the instant they see fire come out of his hands, the same people he just protected turn on him and run him out. The fight is competent, but almost incidental. What it actually exists to do is strip Zuko down to nothing. A disgraced prince with no family left who will claim him, cut against flashbacks of his mother Ursa, and prove that his identity as a firebender will always mark him as a threat to the exact people he is trying to help. Watching him choose, in the moment it matters most, to reveal exactly what he is, rather than let a family he has grown to care about die, and then get punished for that choice anyway, is one of the harder things this show asks a young audience to sit through, and it does it without a single line of dialogue explaining the lesson afterward. The village's reaction, gratitude curdling into fear the instant the fire leaves his hands, gets barely a scene to land, and it trusts its own animation to carry that contradiction rather than spelling it out through dialogue. It is one of the strongest character episodes in the entire series. The fight itself is middling, and that mismatch, a weak fight wrapped around one of the show's best hours of television, is exactly why this list has to judge fights and episodes as two different things, even when they share a runtime. 16 is the drill, Azula's mechanised assault on the outer wall of Ba Sing Se, led alongside Mai and Ty Lee, using a giant mechanical boring machine to try to breach the city in one stroke. What makes this one interesting, from a design standpoint, is where the solution comes from. Team Avatar gets inside the drill itself and starts taking it apart from within, and the series' own reasoning for that tactic traces directly back to Ty Lee's chi blocking, the idea of disabling something by hitting its pressure points, rather than overpowering it head-on. Applied here to a machine instead of a person, it works. The drill is stopped, and it counts as a rare thing in this show, an outright Earth Kingdom victory against Azula's forces, rather than a retreat or a stalemate. That rarity is what pushes it as high as it does on this list, even though the fight itself is more about mechanical problem-solving under time pressure than personal stakes. Watching a machine built specifically to be unstoppable get taken apart by exactly the kind of small, precise interference it was never designed to defend against is satisfying on its own terms, and it works as an early proof of concept of the same lesson the war itself will eventually teach the Fire Nation on a much larger scale. Mai and Ty Lee both get real, if brief, texture here too, well before either of them becomes central to the story. Mai's boredom and Ty Lee's easy cheerfulness already visible, even inside a straightforward assault sequence, a sign the writers were building out the wider cast, long before the plot needed them to matter. Watching this fight again, with everything that happens later already known, Mai's eventual betrayal of Azula and Ty Lee's willingness to physically restrain her own princess, it is worth noticing how little either woman is written as a true believer, even here. Both of them following orders, with a specific, low-grade boredom, people doing a job rather than serving a cause. 15 is Jet's freedom fighters against the Fire Nation soldiers occupying the village of Gaipan, and this is the first entry on the list, where the villain and the hero of the fight are, functionally, the same person. Jet's group harasses the occupying soldiers, effectively, for most of the episode, but the fight the show actually cares about is the one that happens once Aang and Katara learn what Jet is planning to do to win, break a dam, and flood the entire village, soldiers and civilians together, rather than accept a partial victory. Aang and Katara turn on him mid-plan and subdue him themselves, while Sokka races to warn and evacuate the village before the water hits. This is a fight against an ally, rather than an enemy, a shape this show returns to more than once, and the first real crack in Jet's righteousness, well before the series finishes that arc properly 2 books later. Jet himself is worth a specific credit here, since the artbook reportedly names the individual animator responsible for his character design, a rare instance if the credit is accurate, of the series crediting one specific person or one specific character rather than the usual blanket studio acknowledgement. A small line in a book most viewers will never open, but it means the sharp, coiled way Jet moves in this fight, all nervous energy dressed up as confidence, traces back to a named artist rather than an anonymous production pipeline. That is the last of the tier where a fight's real function is to expose something about a character, an identity that will not stay hidden, a righteousness that curdles once it is tested. From here up, the fights start doing something slightly different. They stop being about proving who someone is and start being demonstrations of pure, honed skill, competence for its own sake, which is its own kind of pleasure to watch, even when the story stakes underneath it are relatively modest. 14 is a fight most viewers do not even register as a fight the first time through, because it arrives wrapped inside a flashback. In the storm, young Zuko, having spoken out of turn in a Fire Nation war council, is forced into a formal Agni Kai against the man who called the meeting, and it takes most viewers a beat to realise that man is not some general or rival, it is his own father, Fire Lord Ozai. Zuko refuses to fight. He begs instead, on his knees, in front of the entire court, and Ozai burns his face and banishes him for the refusal. This barely qualifies as a duel, since only one side ever raises a hand, but no few seconds of violence in the entire series matter more. The scar that defines Zuko's face, and his arc for 3 full books, and it is worth knowing that Azula is actually present in this exact scene, standing silently beside Zhao and Yuro, unnamed on screen, in what the series wiki records as her first technical appearance in the series, well before she gets a line of dialogue anywhere. It does not rank higher because it is not, structurally, a fight in the way the rest of this list means the word. It ranks this high because almost nothing else on this list matters more. And Azula's presence in that same room, silent, unnamed, simply standing where a future monster is being quietly made, is one of the more chilling background details in the entire series once you notice it. A child watching her own father teach the family lesson about what happens to weakness, filing it away long before she ever gets a line of her own. 13 is the chase, and this is the entry where its film influences are most openly on display. Azula, tracking Team Avatar using nothing but a tuft of fur her spies picked up off Appa, corners Aang alone in an abandoned town using a Fire Nation vehicle built for speed. Zuko, independently tailing the same group, shows up uninvited, and for a stretch of the episode you get 3 people who all have reasons to fight each other, refusing to make the first move, circling instead, until Team Avatar, Zuko and Yuro end up briefly allied against Azula before she injures Yuro and escapes. The show's own Avatar Extras trivia track, which used to run as pop-up commentary during broadcasts, confirmed this was a deliberate homage to the standoff climax of Western films, like the good, the bad and the ugly, 3 armed parties, 1 circle, nobody willing to blink first. That confirmation matters, because it tells you the tension here was engineered shot by shot, rather than a happy accident of blocking, and it is a good example of how consciously film literate this show's fight direction actually was, even in an episode that is mostly build-up and almost no contact. What lifts it above a handful of busier fights on this list is the sheer number of relationships being renegotiated in that one dusty street at the same time. Zuko choosing, however briefly and however grudgingly, to stand next to the people he has spent an entire season hunting, and Azula watching that alliance form in real time and deciding, correctly, that her brother is no longer entirely on her side of this war. The vehicle chase leading up to the standoff is worth a mention on its own too. Azula piloting a machine built purely for speed across open terrain, tracking her own family by a scrap of fur. Small, almost absurd detail that it plays completely straight, which somehow makes it funnier and more unsettling at the same time. 12 is Katara against Hammer, and this is the fight that introduces bloodbending to the series. which makes it one of the more disturbing entries on this list, regardless of where it lands in the ranking. Hammer is an elderly Southern Water Tribe waterbender who was imprisoned by the Fire Nation decades earlier and, in captivity, invented the technique by secretly practicing on the vermin in her cell during full moons, the only nights the technique works at all. When she finally corners Katara, she uses it on her, then on Aang and Sokka, forcing their bodies to move against their own will, and Katara only breaks the standoff by drawing on the same full moon and bloodbending Hammer right back. Hammer gets arrested. She also tells Katara, before she is taken away, that she is proud a waterbender of the Southern tribe learned the technique, a genuinely unsettling note to end an episode on, since it frames what just happened as an inheritance rather than a one-time horror. One caveat: since this show would later get a direct sequel, The Legend of Korra revealed that a bender named Jaconi and his sons Tarlok and Ammon could bloodbend without a full moon at all, a natural gift rather than a learned technique, which complicates the neat full moon rule this episode sets up as if it were universal. That is Korra material, a different series, and it does not undo what happens here, but it is worth knowing the rule was never quite as absolute as this episode makes it feel. What makes Katara's side of this fight so uncomfortable to watch is how good she turns out to be at it on her very first attempt, a technique she has never practiced, deployed under pressure with a control that unsettles even her, and the episode is smart enough to let that unease sit on her face rather than framing her win as a clean, triumphant moment, the way most of this show's victories are framed. Hammer's parting line to her, that she is proud a waterbender of the Southern tribe learned it, is the detail that keeps this fight lodged in people's memory long after the finale's bigger battles have faded, since it recasts what should be a rescue as something closer to a corruption Katara will now have to carry for the rest of her life. 11 is the Western Air Temple, and this is where Sparky Boom Man's story actually ends. Zuko has just joined Team Avatar, badly, in an episode already tense enough that he accidentally admits, out loud, that he was the one who hired the masked assassin hunting them earlier in the season. That confession is still hanging in the air when the assassin himself attacks the temple. Zuko fights alongside the group he just alienated to help drive him off, which does more to earn him actual trust than anything he says in the episode. And then Sokka finishes the job for good, landing his boomerang directly on the same forehead tattoo Toph nearly hit with a Pebble 2 books earlier, blocking the man's chi-mid blast and causing a fatal self-inflicted explosion. This is a clean piece of long-range plotting, a weak point planted early and paid off later by a different character entirely, and it doubles as the moment Zuko's usefulness in a fight starts to outweigh the group's justified suspicion of him. What I appreciate most about this one is timing rather than choreography. The fact that Zuko never gets a clean, uncomplicated moment to prove himself, trust arriving in the same breath as the worst possible confession, which is a far more honest way to write a redemption than letting him earn it on easy terms. 10 is Zuko against Commander Zhao, a formal Agni Kai, in only the 3rd episode of the entire series, and this one earns its spot on the list, mostly by correcting a misconception a lot of viewers still carry into a rewatch. Zuko wins this duel by unbalancing Zhao's stance, breaking his route as Iroh had coached him beforehand, and then sparing him once he has him beaten, only for Zhao to try to strike him from behind anyway, dishonourably, before Iroh throws him down and ends it. What that fight actually proves, if you watch it without the assumption that Zuko is the weaker sibling still working his way up to competence, is that he is already a master firebender at the start of this show, capable of beating a full Fire Nation commander in a formal duel. His reputation as the lesser talent in his family has nothing to do with his own skill, and everything to do with Azula being a once-in-a-generation prodigy, and Ozai favouring her for it. That correction is worth making plainly, because Zuko starts weak and levels up is one of the most common misreadings of this entire show, and the very first real fight he has on screen already disproves it. His arc across 3 seasons was never about acquiring skill he lacked. It was about deciding what to do with skill he already had, which side of the war deserved it. And that is a much more interesting question for a show to spend 3 years answering than a simple training montage would have been. Zhao himself deserves a small note here too, since he spends this entire duel treating Zuko as an inconvenience rather than a real threat right up until the moment he loses. And that same arrogance, unlearned, is exactly what gets him killed a season and a half later at the North Pole, refusing a hand offered by the same prince he underestimated here. In the art book, the key animation for this exact Agni Kai is said to be individually credited to a specific animation team, a level of specific, named credit this show does not hand out for every fight, which suggests the crew already understood how important getting this one right would be for the rest of the series. That is the top of the tier, built almost entirely on proving competence, and it is a natural place to notice something about the numbering itself. The fight ranked highest in that stretch is also, chronologically, the earliest one in the entire series, which should tell you plainly that this countdown is not simply rewarding whatever comes later in the run. Everything from here up earns its position through consequence, not chronology. 9 is Lake Laogai, and this is where Jet's story ends. In an episode the creators themselves worked unusually hard to get right. Jet has been brainwashed by Longfeng, the head of Ba Sing Sai's secret police, and Aang breaks him free of it mid-fight, at which point Jet turns immediately and fights Longfeng himself to buy his friends time to escape. He loses. What happens to him after that is left deliberately ambiguous on screen. Nothing you could point to as proof of a death, and for years fans have argued about whether he actually died there. He did. That same Avatar Extras track confirmed it directly, off-screen, even though Nickelodeon's standards and practices would not permit an explicit on-screen character death for a Nickelodeon-rated show. Landing on that exact ambiguous version apparently took real effort behind the scenes, since the DVD commentary, with DiMartino, Konietzko, and writer Tim Hedrick all present, suggests the scene went through several rounds of rewrites before they settled on what actually aired, and the sense that commentary leaves you with is that the final, unresolved version served Longfeng's characterization as a villain better than the earlier, more explicit drafts had. Years later, when Jean Luen Yang was drafting the comic The Promise, his first pass actually brought Jet back as a protester, since he judged the character's fate ambiguous enough to justify it, before he was told directly that Jet had died for good. Since the sense he came away with was that, unlike the Marvel and DC universes, death in the Avatar verse is meant to actually stick. That is about as firm a confirmation as this franchise ever gives anything. What stays with me about this fight specifically is how little triumph is left in it by the time it ends. Jet finally free of the brainwashing that has been controlling him for most of the season, finally lucid enough to fight for the right reason, and the show still will not let him win, or even let his death be shown plainly enough to properly grieve on screen. A hard, quiet way to close out a character who spent his introduction convinced he was the hero of his own story. The sequence itself was storyboarded by Joaquim dos Santos, and the DVD commentary has him talking specifically about the challenge of keeping several fights happening at once legible to an audience without ever losing track of who is fighting whom, plus a deliberate choice to frame one of Toph's individual combat shots with a very particular visual symmetry, the kind of composition decision that most viewers feel without ever consciously registering it, which is more or less how good storyboarding is supposed to work. 8 is the Southern Raiders, and it belongs on a list of fights only in the loosest sense, because the actual violence in it is almost incidental to what the episode is really doing. Zuko helps Katara track down Yon Ra, the retired Fire Nation captain who killed her mother, and once they find and subdue him, the real confrontation is entirely verbal. Katara learns the full story, that her mother lied and claimed to be the last waterbender in the village specifically to protect her, which is why Yon-Ra killed Kya instead of taking a young Katara prisoner. And then Katara chooses not to kill him, though she makes very clear she is not forgiving him either. The episode turns morally uncomfortable for a separate reason too, since fans have long debated whether Katara's control over Yon-Ra in that moment implies she is bloodbending him without saying so on screen, something the series never confirms or denies outright. I will say this plainly, since a script like this one should have an actual opinion rather than just reporting one. This episode earns its reputation as one of the best character pieces in the entire series, but it is a strange fit for a Fights rank list, because its power comes almost entirely from Katara choosing not to use the power she clearly has, and that restraint is a harder thing to rank on a scale built for combat than almost anything else on this countdown. There is a version of this scene, easy to imagine, where Katara kills him, and it would have earned that ending too, given everything Yon-Ra took from her. The scene chooses the harder, less satisfying option instead, mercy without forgiveness, a distinction most stories are not patient enough to sit inside for a full scene the way this one does. Zuko's role in all of this is worth naming plainly as well, since he does not try to talk Katara out of anything, does not moralise at her, simply shows up and helps her track the man down, and then lets her decide, alone, what happens once they find him, which is its own quiet form of respect from a character who spent his first season on this list trying to control outcomes he had no right to control. 7 is Crossroads of Destiny, and this is really 3 separate confrontations happening at once, which is part of why it ranks as high as it does, while Aang works with Gurupathic to open his chakras one by one, getting all the way to the final one, love and attachment, tied directly to Katara. Before he's interrupted, Azula is executing an actual coup a short distance away. He strikes a deal with the imprisoned Dai Li leader Long Feng, waits until his own agents genuinely control the city for her, and then betrays him outright, telling him flatly that he had hard work while she had divine rights, before overthrowing the Earth King entirely. Zuko is offered a real path to redemption by Iroh in this same episode, and chooses instead to attack the Avatar directly, and Azula finishes it by hitting a fully merged Avatar state Aang with lightning, a wound the show treats as gravely serious rather than a standard defeat, precisely because of what it means for the reincarnation cycle when Avatar dies while merged with all their past lives. Iroh, alone, holds off an entire wave of Fire Nation and Dai Li soldiers, so the rest of the group can get Aang's body out. But Sing Se falls by the end of it. This is the fight where the series first proves it is willing to let the villains actually win decisively at the close of a full season, rather than reset back to a stalemate, and that willingness is exactly what earns it a spot this high. What sits with me longest about this one is the cruelty of the timing. Aang finally within reach of the exact emotional breakthrough the entire season has been building toward, one chakra away, interrupted a heartbeat before he gets there, not by failure, but by someone else's victory arriving first. Azula's line to Long Feng that he had hard work while she had divine rights is worth pulling out on its own, since it is about as concise a statement of how she views the entire war as the series ever gives her. Competence as something you use once and then discard the moment it stops being useful to you. One thread runs underneath several of the fights already covered on this list, without ever being named outright as its own idea. Ty Lee's chi blocking, first introduced as a strange, almost comic party trick, keeps resurfacing at exactly the moments where raw bending power stops being enough on its own. The inside-out infiltration of the drill, the standoff on the gondola at the Boiling Rock. And it is worth noticing what that pattern actually argues across 3 seasons, that the strongest benders in this world remain vulnerable to something as simple as a well-placed strike to the right nerve, and that the show consistently rewards characters willing to fight smarter rather than harder. Sokka, Suki, Toph, Mai, Ty Lee, none of them bend anything, and between them they end up responsible for a disproportionate share of the fights that actually decide the war. Most of what is left on this countdown comes from Book 3, which is not an accident of taste, so much as a reflection of what the writing staff actually had time to build once Nickelodeon brought the show back from the brink. A season that almost did not get made turned out to contain nearly every fight this list considers essential, which is either a remarkable coincidence or proof that the writers, given a second chance they were not sure they would get, made sure not to waste it. 6 belongs entirely to Sokka, Suki and Toph, and it is the clearest example in the whole series of this show, trusting its non-Avatar characters to end the war themselves, without Aang anywhere nearby. During Sozin's Comet, while Zuko and Katara are fighting Azula and Aang is fighting Ozai on opposite sides of the map, the three of them hijack a Fire Nation airship over the burning tree line of Wulong Forest and ram it directly into the rest of Ozai's Comet enhanced fleet, destroying nearly the entire armada that was meant to burn the Earth Kingdom to the ground. Partway through, Toph rips a door clean off one of the airships and metal bends it into improvised armour to block a captain's blasts, which is as good a single image as this show ever produces for what her invented bending style actually lets her do under real combat pressure rather than in a controlled arena. A straight line from a scared, imprisoned 12-year-old bending a cage for the first time to a young woman turning enemy hardware into a shield mid-battle without breaking stride. None of the three of them are benders in the way Aang, Zuko or Katara are treated as benders, and none of them get anything close to the screen time the Avatar himself gets in this same stretch of episodes. And yet, this is arguably the single biggest military victory in the entire war, full stop, achieved by a swordsman, a warrior and an earthbender working as a unit with no spiritual power backing any of it up. This is the fight this list has been building toward, without saying so directly, proof that the show never actually believed the war could only be won by the Avatar, and it hands that proof to the three characters everyone around them is quickest to underestimate, including, at times, the story itself. Sokka in particular gets something close to a full circle moment here. The same character who once panicked over a war balloon prototype in a snowbound temple, now commanding an actual hijacked airship into the heart of the enemy's own fleet. Competence built up in small increments across 2 full seasons, finally allowed to matter at full scale. 5 is the Day of Black Sun, and this is the invasion the entire back half of Book 3 has been building toward, only for it to fail. Team Avatar, Sokka's father Hakoda, King Bumi, and the Order of the White Lotus launch a full assault on the Fire Nation capital, timed to a solar eclipse, the one period when firebenders lose their bending entirely. And Aang gets close enough to Ozai to end the war outright, but cannot bring himself to kill him. The eclipse runs out, firebending returns to the Fire Nation soldiers mid-battle, and the invasion collapses. In the same episode, Zuko, who has just defected, confronts Ozai directly, is nearly killed by a lightning bolt, and redirects it at the last possible second, using the exact technique Iroh taught him, guiding the charge through his body and releasing it through a limb, rather than letting it pass anywhere near his heart. That rule is not decoration. It will decide whether Zuko lives or dies in the fight still, to come at the very top of this list. The eclipse itself gives the fight a ticking clock, unlike almost anything else on this list. Every character on screen, watching the sky as much as their opponent, aware that whatever advantage they are working with is about to expire on a schedule nobody can negotiate with. He escapes, breaks Iroh out of prison, and joins Team Avatar for good. This is the fight that proves the invasion plan itself, brilliant as it looks on paper, was never actually going to be enough, and that the real ending of this war was always going to require something the eclipse alone could not provide. What makes this one hard to watch, even on a rewatch, knowing exactly how it ends, is how close it gets before it fails. Ozai fully cornered, defenceless, the eclipse still holding, and Aang simply unable to make himself throw the final blow. A hesitation the show does not judge him for, but does not let him off the hook for either, since hesitating here cost the invasion everything. 4 is the boiling rock breakout, and this is the most purely fun entry on the entire list, right up until it very suddenly is not. Sokka, with Zuko's help, infiltrates the boiling rock prison to break out Suki and his own father, Hakoda. And everything is going reasonably well, right up until Azula arrives personally to retake control of the facility, a volcanic island prison with nowhere to run to, and, for most of the episode, no real way off it at all, beyond the single cable car connecting it to the mainland, a setting that turns every fight staged inside it into a fight with its own exit, already sealed off before the first. Punch lands. Suki fights Ty Lee. Sokka and Zuko fight Azula together on top of a moving gondola suspended over boiling water. Then Mai, who has said almost nothing of consequence for 2 entire seasons, holds Azula at knife point so the group can escape, an act of open betrayal against her own princess that nobody, least of all Azula, saw coming. And Ty Lee, of all people, is the one who physically restrains Azula to stop her from killing Mai for it. Both Mai and Ty Lee are arrested by Azula's remaining loyalists before the episode ends. The storyboard work on this one carries specific, named credits worth knowing. Ian Graham and Lauren Montgomery boarded the first part alongside Kenji Ono, with Tomohiro Yamaguchi credited specifically as the storyboard revisionist. The kind of detailed production paper trail that tells you exactly how many hands actually shaped a sequence this complicated. What earns this fight its spot this high is not the choreography alone, sharp as it is. It is Mai's betrayal landing as a genuine surprise on a character the show had spent 2 seasons training you to read as indifferent to everything, which is a much harder trick to pull off than a well-staged sword fight. Ty Lee's choice a moment later matters just as much and gets talked about far less. A trained loyalist physically disabling her own princess to save a friend in front of witnesses with no plan for what happens to her afterward. And what happens to her afterward is exactly what you would expect. Arrest alongside Mai. No reward for doing the right thing at the worst possible time. This show is unusually willing to let loyalty cost something instead of simply paying off. Before we get there, the fight taking the 3rd spot on this countdown breaks the pattern the last several entries just established, since it comes not from the season that almost never got made, but from the very first season, back when nobody involved knew whether the show would even get a second one. Number 3 is The Siege of the North, the 2-part finale of Book 1, and it is really several fights stacked on top of each other, which is part of why it earns a spot this high before we even get to the Book 3 material. The Fire Nation, under Admiral Zhao, launches a full naval assault on the Northern Water Tribe, and inside that single siege, you get Zuko dueling Katara at the Spirit Oasis and beating her as the sunrise gives his firebending an edge. Then a second confrontation once he has stolen Aang's unconscious body, where Katara, no longer facing a sunrise disadvantage, beats him decisively enough that Aang refuses to leave him behind in the snow to die. Separately, and far more consequentially, Zhao makes his way into the Oasis and kills the Moon Spirit in its koi fish form, despite Iroh warning him directly not to touch it. And Iroh's response is to fight Zhao's own men in a rage once the damage is already done. Princess Yue, who was given her life force as a sick infant by that same spirit, sacrifices herself to revive it, becoming the new Moon Spirit and dying as a mortal in the process. Aang, in the Avatar state, merges with the Ocean Spirit, La, and the show lets him level an entire invading armada with it, a scale of destruction it does not repeat anywhere else in the series, before the Ocean Spirit drags Zhao under the water to die, having refused Zuko's hand at the very last second. The production side of this one is worth knowing in some detail, because it is an unusual case of the series splitting storyboard duty by individual scene rather than by episode. Ethan Spalding boarded Aang's aerial battle against the fleet, while Dean Kelly boarded the entire Zuko and Katara confrontation. And in a nice bit of in-house trivia, the minor character Han was actually designed to look like Dean Kelly himself. The black snow that falls across several of these scenes was not just a mood choice either. It was built specifically to represent Fire Nation industrial pollution bleeding into a pristine environment, a visual argument about what this war actually costs the world, laid quietly into the background art rather than spoken out loud by any character. And there is a strange footnote some fans still bring up here too, since it hints at how loosely timed material was ever held to the series' own continuity. A promotional trading card released around the Book 1 premiere reportedly claimed that it was Zhao who scarred Zuko's face, teasing whether he would come to regret sparing the prince's life. The series, of course, establishes clearly that it was Ozai who did that, in a different episode entirely, and the card was never formally corrected, just quietly outrun by the canon itself. What lands this fight at number 3, rather than lower, is the sheer number of consequential things happening inside one 2-part episode. A villain's death, a sacrifice that becomes a permanent piece of the world's cosmology, and the first time the Avatar state is shown doing something on a truly mythic scale. The show also treats its 2 spirit deaths differently within the same episode. The moon spirit's death briefly threatens to undo the balance of an entire ocean, forcing a literal act of self-sacrifice to fix, while Zhao's death, seconds later, is treated almost coldly. A man who chose cruelty and got exactly the ending that cruelty earns him. No mourning, no final redemption offered. This show rarely lets a villain's death pass without some shading of tragedy. Zhao is one of the very few it lets go without any. What stands out most, looking at this 2-part siege against everything ranked below it on this list, is the sheer scale of what the writers chose to burn through in a single season finale. A spirit's death, a princess's permanent sacrifice, an entire armada levelled in one stroke. Material a more cautious show might have rationed out across several later seasons instead. Number 2 is Aang against Fire Lord Ozai, now self-declared Phoenix King, at Wulong Forest during Sozin's Comet. And this is the fight the entire series has been pointed at from its very first episode. A 12-year-old pacifist finally forced to stand across from the man planning to burn an entire continent to the ground. Ozai, supercharged by the comet, slams Aang into rock hard enough that his final chakra, the one Guru Pathik could never get him to open voluntarily, snaps open involuntarily under the trauma, and Aang gets a vision drawn from 4 of his named past lives: Roku, Kyoshi, Kuruk, and Yangchen, rather than some infinite unbroken chain of every avatar who ever lived, which is a distinction worth being precise about, since it is easy to misremember the scene as bigger than it actually is. That surge is enough to let him overwhelm Ozai completely in the avatar state. And then, with Ozai fully beaten and completely at his mercy, Aang stops. He remembers a lesson taught to him earlier by a lion turtle, and instead of killing Ozai, which every version of this story he has ever been told would tell him to do, he uses energy bending, a technique he has effectively only just learned, to strip Ozai of his firebending permanently instead. He spares him. What genuinely surprises me every time is how much weight the show puts behind that choice, not to kill, since so much of Book 3 has been building toward the opposite expectation: war, invasion, a final confrontation, and then the actual climax argues directly against the genre it has spent 60 episodes living inside. Energy bending itself is framed in universe as extremely rare and truly dangerous, capable of taking bending away entirely, or, as we will see in the very next fight, granting it. And Aang is warned outright before he attempts it that doing it wrong could kill Ozai rather than simply disable him. He does it anyway, correctly, under enormous pressure, having practiced the technique exactly once before, on a much smaller scale, earlier in the season, on a lion turtle's own guidance, rather than any real independent mastery of his own, which makes the precision of the outcome here feel almost as improbable inside the story as it does from the outside watching it. What most viewers do not know is how long some of the specific pieces of this exact confrontation had been sitting in the creator's notes before the finale scripts were actually written. According to DiMartino and Konietzko, speaking years later for the series' 20th anniversary, certain beats were locked into the original planning documents, almost from the beginning. Aang being protected inside a stone cocoon during Ozai's lightning strike, and the basic shape of Ozai wielding Comet supercharged firebending during their final confrontation, even though most other episodes in the series needed considerable extra work beyond what the original series Bible had sketched out. This was one of the few places where the destination never really moved. There was also, at one point, a very different future planned for Aang's relationship with this exact power. Aaron Ehas described at a convention panel years after the show ended, a book 4 that was fairly seriously developed before the creative team's attention shifted elsewhere, and one thread of it would have dealt with the actual cost of what Aang does here. Taking someone's bending in that scrapped version would not have been clean. It would have left the person who did it carrying the victim's own dark, complicated, angry energy, and Aang would have spent part of that unmade season fighting not to be corrupted by whatever was left of Ozai's rage after the fact, with Zuko coaching him through it, conceived, in Ahas's own words, as something close to a real-world allegory for absorbing someone else's trauma secondhand. None of that is canon. It never got made, but it tells you the creators themselves were not entirely comfortable treating energy bending as a clean, cost-free ending, even if the version that actually aired plays it that way. This fight ranks second rather than first, for one reason. The choice it builds to is a strong ending for Aang's arc, but it is Aang refusing to fight in the way the moment demands, and a countdown built partly on fight ambition has to weigh that against an entry where both sides go all the way. Before we get to the single fight almost every outlet that has ranked this series puts at the very top, it is worth lingering on a stretch of material that never made it to the screen at all, because some of it would have directly reshaped how the fights on this list are remembered, and none of it is common knowledge, even among people who have watched the series more than once. Start with the character who anchors half the fights on this list, without ever throwing a punch himself. Iroh, as originally conceived, was not the warm, tea-obsessed uncle fans know. Per the art of the animated series, the companion book published alongside the show, he started as a fairly generic hard-ass martial arts instructor, a gruff Sifu figure, training Zuko, because that was his job, nothing more. It was head writer Aaron Ehas who pushed to reframe him instead as a guy who is trying to enjoy his retirement, but keeps getting stuck watching over his nephew. And that single reframing is the reason Euros fights, the ones where he single-handedly holds off soldiers in Ba Sing Se, the one where he tears through Sao's men after the moon spirit is killed, land the way they do. He is not a stock mentor doing his job. He is a tired old man who would rather be drinking tea, choosing every single time to fight anyway. That single reframe is doing more work than almost any other production decision named in this whole research pass, because it is the reason his stand against Fire Nation and Dai Li soldiers during Azula's coup, covered further up this list, lands as tragedy rather than simple action hero heroics. An old man who has already told you repeatedly in scene after scene that he would rather not be doing this, and who does it anyway, every time, because the people around him need him to. The creators have also been unusually candid about which episode they consider the series' actual low point, and it is worth naming here, since it involves the least memorable fight in the entire series, one not worth its own entry on this list. On the official Braving the Elements podcast, DiMartino called The Great Divide pretty filler why, and admitted flatly that it was a pretty dumb idea, while Konietzko was even blunter, calling it terrible and describing it as a big, empty hole in the middle of the season. Neither of them defends it. For the people who made something this acclaim to say a specific episode outright failed is genuinely rare, and it tells you something about how deliberately everything ranked above it on this list was actually built. In contrast, There was also, at one point, a plan for Momo to be confirmed as something far stranger than a comic relief lemur. The pop-up Avatar Extras commentary for the Southern Air Temple, the episode where Aang finds Monk Gyatso's remains, reveals the writers seriously considered an episode that would have confirmed on screen that Momo is Gyatso reincarnated. They ultimately decided an unconfirmed hint played better than a flat confirmation would have, which is why the series only ever gestures at it. Momo's odd attachment to Aang, a handful of visual echoes, never a line of dialogue that closes the loop. That is restraint working in the show's favour, choosing a question over an answer. And then there is the scrapped Book 4, which we touched on briefly, around the Aang and Ozai fight, but which deserves a fuller picture here, because it would have reshaped several relationships already covered on this list. Aaron Ehas laid out its rough shape at a convention panel long after the finale aired, an Azula redemption arc, following her breakdown at the end of Book 3, where she would have turned to Zuko for help, deliberately mirroring the way Zuko himself once turned to Iroh, the exact dynamic that makes his own redemption in Book 3 work as well as it does. Alongside that, a spirit world arc centred on Iroh, and a strange, quiet thread where Aang would have found himself questioning whether a newborn child he encountered was the reincarnation of Monk Gyatso, a direct continuation of the very idea the writers chose to leave unconfirmed back in Book 1. There is a real symmetry in that Azula thread worth sitting with for a moment, since it would have mirrored, almost beat for beat, the exact redemption Book 3 already gave Zuko, a sibling who spent the whole war certain of her own superiority, broken down to nothing, and then offered the same hand her brother once was. None of this ever got scripted in full. The creative team's attention shifted toward the live-action film project instead, and Book 4 stayed a set of notes and convention panel recollections, rather than an actual season. You are allowed to feel a little robbed by that, an entire redemption arc for one of this show's best villains that we will never actually get to see animated, but nothing scrapped and unfinished should ever be treated as if it happened. What we have is what aired, and what aired is what this whole countdown is actually ranking. Step back before the final entry and look at what these fights are actually built out of underneath the animation, because almost none of it is invented from nothing. Every bending style in this show is grounded in a real martial art, chosen deliberately by martial arts consultant Sifukas, and the choices tell you something about how each nation is meant to feel in motion, long before any dialogue does that work for you. Firebending is built on northern Shaolin Kung Fu, tracing back to the actual Shaolin monastery in Henan province, where monks historically trained with staff and spear weapons before ever moving to unarmed combat, which is exactly why firebending choreography leans so heavily on leaping kicks and spinning parries, an armed fighting style translated into an unarmed one. Toph is the interesting exception inside earthbending, since most earthbenders in this show move through Hungar, but Kisu gave her a distinct substyle on purpose. Southern praying mantis Kung Fu, a tighter, more sensitive style, built around reading an opponent's smallest movements, which fits a blind fighter who reads the world entirely through vibration rather than sight. And the Agni Kai itself, the show's single most recognisable dueling format, the raised platform, the ritual, the entire community gathered to witness it as a test of honour. It's not actually Chinese or Japanese in origin at all. It is modelled specifically on Kalaripayattu, a South Indian dueling tradition, right down to the platform and the communal witnessing, a deliberate real-world anchor that almost no viewer clocks on a first watch, or a 10th one, because nothing on screen ever announces it. The physical world these fights happen inside was built by a much smaller group of people than you would expect for a show with this much visual detail across 61 episodes. Elsa Garagaza did the bulk of the background design and layout work, down to specific touches like the whalebone detailing on the Northern Water Tribe's armoury, and Brian Evans painted most of the final backgrounds from her designs, with a rotating group of other background designers, including Dave Filoni, contributing across the run. Every siege, every temple, every prison yard a fight breaks out in on this list passed through that same small pipeline before it ever reached the animators, actually drawing the characters, moving through it. That armory detail belongs to the exact location that Book 1's finale, still to come near the top of this countdown, is staged inside, whalebone worked into the walls of a building under direct assault, set dressing built to communicate an entire culture's relationship to the sea before any spoken line gets the chance to. None of this came free of network interference either, and it is worth being honest about where Nickelodeon's own standards actually shaped what made it to air. The clearest example has nothing to do with combat directly. Concept art for Azula, Mai, and Ty Lee's swimsuit designs in the Book 3 episode The Beach, reproduced from the series' own art book, shows Nickelodeon's standards and practices department rejected the originals as too revealing and sent them back to be redrawn. There is a reasonable theory, floated by fans who have compared the concept art directly, that the first versions may have been drawn deliberately more revealing than the team ever expected to get approved. Specifically so, the still bold final version would look like a compromise rather than a first draft, a small, almost funny piece of negotiating strategy, if true. And it says something about how much friction existed between what this show's creative team wanted to draw and what a children's network was willing to broadcast. On the more mundane end of that same friction, the DVD commentary for that same two-part finale has Aaron Ehas mentioning, almost in passing, that they had written a long explanatory block about how the trebuchets bombarding the Northern Water Tribe's wall actually worked, and cut the whole thing for pacing rather than any content objection. A useful reminder that not every trimmed scene in this show's history was a fight against a network. Sometimes it was just a fight against the runtime. The broader standards question sits underneath every single entry on this entire list, whether or not any one episode's commentary calls it out directly. Aaron Ehas and a former standards and practices director have both spoken, separately, about the basic constraints every fight in this show had to work inside. Action could not be graphic, blows could not connect in ways that read as real injury, and death, as this list has already covered more than once, almost never got to be shown outright, only implied and later confirmed off-screen through the DVD commentary. That constraint is exactly why this show leans so hard on redirection, on restraints, on a character choosing not to finish an opponent even when the story has clearly earned the option. Katara sparing Yon-Ra, Aang sparing Ozai, Sokka finishing Combustion Man only through the character's own weapon turning back on him rather than a direct kill. None of that reads as the show pulling its punches once you know the limitation was there from the start. It reads more like a writing staff that turned a network's restriction into one of its steadiest themes, merciless as a moral lesson bolted on top of the story, and more as the only ending standards and practices would actually let them draw. The series' own internationalisation is a strange little rabbit hole on its own, and it touches names you have heard throughout this entire countdown. The UK broadcast retitled the whole series Avatar, The Legend of Aang, because the word bender carries slang connotations in British English that Nickelodeon wanted to avoid entirely, an entire branding decision built around one word. The Russian dub is said to have changed Suki's name across different parts of the series, apparently because it sounded close enough to a Russian profanity that broadcasters did not want to risk it. And in some other regional dubs, Katara's own name was swapped out entirely to Tamra, reportedly because Katara read as inauspicious in that market, a strange echo of the exact naming pressure the character's own name faced before the show ever aired, which this script will get to properly before the night is out. The Kyoshi warrior who held her own against Zuko's raiders, and the waterbender who ends this whole story facing down Azula, were, in some households, watching this exact show. Never actually called by the names we have been using all night. A couple of places are worth naming, where the series' own internal logic never quite closes the loop it opens, since a countdown built on fight rules should be honest about where those rules get a little thin. Zuko is set up across multiple episodes as someone who cannot generate his own lightning because of unresolved inner conflict. Nero names that as the exact reason directly, and the show gives him every opportunity afterward to have found peace with himself, reconciling with his family, choosing his own side, ending the war on the right side of it, and yet he never actually generates lightning on screen, not even after Sozin's comet. Once the internal conflict is supposedly resolved, the fix is set up. It is never paid off. Similarly, Aang spends years travelling with two of the ablest benders in the world, Katara, who becomes skilled enough at healing to be sought out across two different series, and Toph, who invents an entire new branch of earthbending and never learns either skill from either of them on screen, a gap the original series simply never addresses, one made more conspicuous once the legend of Korra later calls Korra the franchise's first metal-bending avatar, which quietly confirms Aang skipped it entirely rather than just never mentioning it. And since metal bending has come up twice now, without its own origin story getting told properly, it is worth being precise about that origin, since it is a detail this channel has gotten wrong before and is not going to get wrong again. Toph did not invent metal bending in the back of some Fire Nation cart, offhandedly, between other scenes. He invented it while genuinely trapped, locked inside a metal cage by a pair of Earth Kingdom bounty hunters, Jin Fu and Master Yu, who had been hired by her own father to bring her home. No Fire Nation soldier is anywhere near that scene. The single greatest bending discovery in the entire series happens because a blind 12-year-old girl, imprisoned by people her own family paid, refuses to accept that the cage around her counts as solid ground. With all of that as the foundation these fights are actually built on, real martial arts, a small overworked art department, network notes, cut dialogue, translated names, it is worth setting this particular ranking next to the other lists people have already published about this exact show, since we promised at the start to be honest about where they agree and where they do not. The difference between a crowd-voted list and a critic-authored one matters before comparing them directly, since they are not really measuring the same thing. The crowd vote rewards whatever fight left the strongest single impression on the largest number of individual viewers, which tends to favour emotional peaks people still remember years later. The critics list is more likely to weigh craft, structure, and long-term consequence deliberately, even for a fight that did not necessarily hit hardest on a first watch. Ranker runs a crowd-voted list, built from several hundred individual votes rather than one critic's opinion, and at the top of that list, consistently, sits the same fight we are about to close this countdown with: Zuko and Katara against Azula, followed by Aang against Ozai, then a battle involving the Order of the White Lotus, reclaiming Ba Sing Se. Screen Rant runs its own critic-authored top 10, and, by most accounts, lands on the exact same fight, in the exact same spot, pointing to both the animation quality of that sequence and the emotional weight of Zuko choosing to jump in front of a lightning bolt meant for someone else. CBR has taken a different approach entirely, running separate rankings for each individual book rather than one list across the whole series, an approach that has its own value since it lets a lower stakes early fight, like Zuko against Sao, get judged fairly against its own season rather than getting buried under finale scale spectacle it was never trying to compete with. CBR also runs a dedicated list of the most creative fights, which singles out the energy bending finish against Ozai, specifically for how unusual a resolution it is compared to literally anything else the show does with a fight, and a separate list of the most evenly matched fights in the series run. Cinema Blend and The Gamer both published their own top 10s as well, both weighted more toward general reader appeal and shareability than deep critical argument, and across every one of these outlets, crowd voted and critic authored alike, the same handful of fights keep reappearing near the very top, no matter who is doing the ranking. The finale Agni Kai, Aang against Ozai, the Armada destroying climax of Book 1's finale, and the Boiling Rock breakout. This countdown lines up with that consensus, almost exactly at the top, which is not a coincidence and not something to apologise for. When 5 separate outlets, built on 5 separate methodologies, all land in roughly the same place, that convergence is itself a kind of evidence, a sign that whatever criteria you actually use, story stakes, animation ambition, character consequence, the same handful of sequences keep rising to the surface regardless. That convergence also means a viewer who only ever reads one of these lists is not actually getting a distorted picture of the series' best fights, which is not something you can say about most long-running franchises, once fandom opinion has had 2 decades to fracture into competing camps. There is a pattern worth naming across the 3 season-ending fights this countdown has now covered. Since laid side by side, they show a writing staff steadily refining the exact same basic shape. Book 1 ends with Aang in the Avatar state, emerging with an actual spirit to save an entire civilization from outside himself, borrowed cosmic power, settling an unwinnable siege. Book 2 ends with Azula's coup succeeding, and Aang struck down mid-transformation, the good guys losing outright for the only time across the whole series. Book 3 ends with 3 separate fights, resolved not by any spirit, not by scale, but by the specific, personal choices of the people actually standing in the fire. Zuko choosing to protect Katara over himself, Katara choosing restraint over a kill, Aang choosing mercy over the ending every past Avatar before him would presumably have chosen instead. The series spends 3 years training its own finale to get smaller and more personal, even as the war around it gets larger, which is an unusual kind of structural discipline for a series that could easily have just kept escalating the special effects instead. Which brings us to number 1. Zuko and Katara, side by side, against Azula, the comet-enhanced Agni Kai, staged during the 3rd part of Sozin's Comet, while Aang is fighting Ozai on one side of the map, and Sokka, Suki, and Toph are tearing through an airship fleet on the other. By this point in the series, 3 seasons in, 60-some episodes of build-up behind it, the show has trained its audience to read a dueling platform as something closer to a courtroom than a battlefield, a place where the outcome always seems to matter more than the physical contest itself. It has used that same platform 3 separate times already across this run. Once for a formal duel between a prince and a commander, once as a memory of a father disfiguring his own son for the crime of compassion, and now, finally, with a fight that closes the loop those 2 earlier scenes opened. Azula walks onto it still composed, still certain of her own superiority, having spent the entire series treating every confrontation as a formality she wins before it starts. Zuko walks onto it having spent the same 3 seasons losing, again and again, to the sister everyone always assumed was simply better than him. Nobody watching, and nobody in universe, expects what actually happens next, and that gap between expectation and outcome is doing as much work in this fight as the choreography itself. Start with what the fight actually is, mechanically, before getting into why it lands the way it does. Zuko challenges Azula formally on the same raised platform, under the same ritual rules as every other Agni Kai the show has staged, specifically to protect Katara, who Azula has decided to target the moment she realises she is losing ground. That framing matters more than it looks like it does at first. This is not 2 siblings settling old business in a vacuum. It is Zuko stepping directly between his sister and someone he has decided is worth protecting, in the exact ritual format their father once used to scar his face and send him away. Azula, visibly unravelling by this point in the finale, breaks the duel's own rules almost immediately, firing lightning not at Zuko, her actual opponent, but at Katara, standing off to the side. Zuko throws himself into its path and redirects it, using the exact technique Hiro taught him, and the exact rule the Day of Black Sun fight already established earlier in this same countdown. Guide the charge through the body, release it through a limb, never let it near the heart. And this time, the technique fails him, not because the redirection itself is wrong, but because his body is not positioned the way it needs to be to safely reroute it, since he threw himself in front of Katara rather than squaring up to defend himself the way the technique actually requires. He is badly hurt. Katara, left alone against an increasingly unstable Azula, fights her one-on-one and wins decisively, freezing her in place, chaining her to a metal grate so she cannot hurt anyone else, and then, without any hesitation, turns straight to Zuko and heals him. Sit with how much this sequence is actually about underneath the choreography. This is Katara's arc, closing out exactly the way the show spent 3 seasons building toward. The girl who lost to Paku before she had any formal training at all, who lost once to Zuko at sunrise before her northern training, now standing alone against a comet, empowered, increasingly unhinged firebending prodigy, and simply beating her cleanly, without help. And it is Zuko's arc closing out too, the boy whose own father scarred him on a platform exactly like this one, the crime of showing compassion, now standing on an identical platform, using fire the same way his father once used it against him, except this time in defence of someone else entirely. The writers do not spell any of that out in dialogue. It does not need to. The platform alone is doing the work. Azula's collapse across this same stretch of episodes deserves a plain acknowledgement too, since the series stages it not as villainy simply defeated, but as a mind coming apart in real time. Years of pressure from an absent mother and a manipulative father finally catching up to her all at once, which reframes the entire duel, less as good, triumphing over evil, and more as one sister finally, catching up to a sibling who had been breaking for longer than anyone around her chose to notice. Now, the piece of behind-the-scenes material that reframes this entire fight, and it is one of the 5 most striking facts in the whole of this research. The show's own official DVD commentary states, in plain language, that Zuko was originally going to be the love interest for Katara. Not implied, not fan speculation, stated directly on the Avatar Extras commentary track for the very first episode, The Avatar Returns, and reinforced again on the commentary of the Ember Island players later in the run, where the writers describe having toyed with the idea seriously enough that it left a mark on the finished show. This sits in direct tension with something DiMartino and Konietzko have said publicly more than once since the series ended, that Katang, Aang and Katara together was always the plan. From day one, no real alternative ever seriously on the table. Both things cannot be fully true at once, and the honest way to hold them is to say plainly that the series' own official commentary and the creators' later public statements disagree with each other, and neither this script nor anyone else gets to resolve that tension on their behalf, tidily or otherwise. What it does mean, though, is that watching this exact fight with that discarded history in mind changes how a few specific beats land. Zuko throwing himself in front of a lightning bolt meant for Katara reads differently once you know that pairing was seriously drafted and then deliberately set aside. Whether or not the writers meant for it to read that way by the time this particular episode actually aired. Years after that early idea was first floated and just as quietly set aside, there is a piece of real-world design history sitting underneath the platform itself too. One already mentioned earlier in this countdown, but worth bringing back here, because this is the fight it was always leading up to. The Agni Kai format, the raise stage, the ritual formality. The whole community gathered to witness a duel as a public test of honour is not Chinese or Japanese in origin, the way most of the rest of this show's fighting vocabulary is. The format is built on Kalarapayattu, a South Indian dueling tradition, and every single Agni Kai across the entire series, Zuko against Sao, at the very bottom tier of this list. A flashback of a young Zuko refusing to fight his own father, and this fight, right here at the very top, all share that same borrowed foundation. A small, deliberate piece of research most viewers never register consciously across 3 entire seasons, and it means this exact platform has been carrying real-world weight since the very first time the series used it. The production side of this particular fight got an unusually public afterlife too. In the artbook, the key animation for specific frames of this Agni Kai is said to carry individual animator credits, the same kind of named specific credit the Zuko vs Zhao duel reportedly received back near the bottom of this list. And years after the finale, Nickelodeon is reported to have released something like the original pencil test animation reel for this exact fight, just the raw choreography as the animators first blocked it out, unfinished and uncoloured. Watching that reel makes something clear that is easy to miss once the final coloured scored version is all anyone remembers. The fight's shape, every redirect, every strike, the whole geometry of Zuko throwing himself into the lightning's path was locked in at the storyboard and pencil test stage, long before a single frame of final colour animation existed, before the music, before the colouring, before any of the polish that usually gets the credit for how a scene like this makes you feel. The emotional weight of the scene was built into the blocking itself, not painted on afterward, which is a fairly unusual thing for most action animation, where the choreography is often locked well before anyone has fully worked out what the scene needs to mean. One more piece of time material is worth knowing here too, mostly because it shows how loosely the extended Avatar universe has treated a rule the original series worked hard to make feel rare and dangerous. In the 2015 and 2016 comic Smoke and Shadow, written by Jean Luen Yang with editorial oversight from Bryan Konietzko, Azula is shown redirecting lightning herself, an ability the television series never once shows her having and never implies she possesses. Across the whole run of the series, lightning redirection belongs specifically to Iroh, who developed it by watching waterbenders, and to Zuko, who Iroh personally trained. Azula generates lightning. She never redirects it on screen, not in this fight, not anywhere. The comic adds the ability years later without ever addressing the gap, and the creative team has never gone back to reconcile it, which means it sits there as an open contradiction between 2 pieces of official canon, one animated, one printed, both endorsed by the same people. A small reminder that canon built across more than one medium rarely stays perfectly tidy, however carefully any one instalment of it was made. Why this fight sits above Aang against Ozai rather than below it is worth pausing on too, since the two are close enough in most published rankings that the order really comes down to what you personally weigh heaviest in a fight. Aang against Ozai is the better ending. It resolves the entire series argument about violence and mercy in one clean, deliberate choice, and nothing else on this list carries that kind of thematic weight, but it resolves that argument by having one side refuse to fully engage, Aang overwhelming Ozai, and then choosing not to finish him, which is a fundamentally different shape than 2 people going all the way against each other and one winning outright. This one has both halves of a fight working at full intensity at the same time, an opponent who does not hold back for even a second, redirection under real physical cost, and a decisive, unambiguous victory, earned rather than granted through restraint. Judged purely as a fight, both sides pushing everything they have against each other, until only one side is left standing. This is the more complete one, and that is the standard this whole countdown said it would use back at the start. None of that changes what actually happens on that platform though, and none of it should. Azula loses, chained and alone, having broken the one rule that mattered most to her own reputation: honour, discipline, control, by firing at the wrong target out of pure desperation. Zuko nearly dies, protecting the person. Azula turns her lightning on mid-duel instead of striking him. Her actual formal opponent, a last-second swap in target, that turns a formal duel between two siblings into something closer to an ambush. And it is Zuko's own instinct, not the rules of the Agni Kai itself, that decides who actually ends up in the lightning's path. And Katara, the character who spent the earliest fight on this exact tier of the countdown, losing to a master before she had any training worth the name, ends the whole series undefeated in the fight that every major ranking out there, and now this one too, agrees belongs at the very top. Looking back across this whole countdown, the animation ambition visibly climbs as the show goes, and you can track it through the same production credits this script has been naming all night. The early Book 1 duels, Zuko against Zhao, Zuko against Katara at the Spirit Oasis, are handled with clean, functional choreography. The kind of martial arts staging Sifu Kisu's forms translate into fairly directly by the time it reaches the boiling rock and the comet-enhanced Agni Kai, JM Animation, Dr. Movie, and the newer Studio Moi Animation are handling sequences with multiple simultaneous combatants, environmental hazards, boiling water, collapsing airship fleets, choreography detailed enough that Nickelodeon later thought it worth releasing the raw pencil tests publicly on their own. None of that happened, because the later fights simply had bigger budgets. It happened because a crew that had already been sent home once came back, determined to make every remaining episode count, and it shows in nearly every fight on the top half of this list. End on how that finale actually landed in the real world, since it is easy to talk about a show like this in purely artistic terms, and forget it was also a broadcast television event that had to survive on ratings, the same ratings that nearly killed it between Book 2 and Book 3. When Sozin's Comet aired, it drew 5.6 million total viewers and was the #1 telecast across all of broadcast and basic cable for that week in the middle of July 2008, a jump of roughly 195% in viewership that time slot compared to the same week the year before. Nickelodeon followed the finale with a rebroadcast blitz of the last 10 episodes, which pulled in 19 million combined views, gave the series 4 separate spots on Nielsen's Top 20 cable results chart that same week, and landed it on iTunes' list of the 10 best-selling television episodes in the country. A show that had been cancelled for months, laid off staff, and all, ended its run as one of the biggest things on cable television that summer. Put that against what the same story costs to make now. The original animated series was produced for somewhere north of $1 million per episode, a real budget, 2005, but a modest one by modern standards, while the reported cost of Netflix's live-action adaptation, which began streaming in 2024, runs upward of $15 million per episode, something close to a 15-fold increase, to tell largely the same set of fights this countdown has spent the last several hours walking through, staged now with real actors and real sets rather than a Korean animation studio's pencils and paints. Whatever you think of the live-action version, and this channel has covered its specific choices at length elsewhere, that gap says something about how far this story's reputation has travelled since a Korean animation studio and a modest Nickelodeon budget first put Zuko on a dueling platform against Zhao. And since we opened tonight with a name that almost was not the name we know, it feels right to close on one too. Katara was not always Katara. As the story tends to be told, Katara was originally written as Kyo, before a last-minute change was made because another name had already been claimed elsewhere. The way it is usually recalled, the change came together quickly, on the road, with Katara arriving almost on the spot. The rejected name did not disappear. Kya became Katara's mother, the woman whose death sets the Southern Raiders' confrontation in motion, partway up this list. And years later, in the legend of Korra, it becomes the name of Katara's own daughter. A name set aside under that pressure ended up threaded through 3 generations of the same family, which is a strange, quiet piece of trivia to end on, but it says something true about this show, generally, that even its accidents tend to find their way back into the story eventually. in much the same way fans have pointed out with the discarded red version of the Blue Spirit mask, an idea that seems to echo through the show's later material. With all of this laid out, end to end, a list like this one is a reading, not a verdict. One way through material generous enough to support several honest orderings, depending on what you actually value in a fight, stakes, choreography, character cost, or the strange, specific research sitting underneath the animation that most viewers never think to go looking for. Almost 20 years on from that first broadcast, in February of 2005, this show still gets talked about with the kind of care usually reserved for things made for adults, not because it avoided being a kids' show, but because it never once talked down to the people watching it. Violence handled with restraint rather than spectacle for its own sake. Endings that chose mercy over triumph more than once. A cast willing to lose a duel and grow from it rather than win every single time. That is not a small thing to have pulled off inside a network animated series airing on Saturday mornings, made under real budget pressure, real network notes, and for a stretch in the middle of its own run. No certainty it would even get to finish telling its story. Ranking every fight in a show like this one is, in the end, an argument you are having with yourself as much as with the other outlets that have already tried it, since the categories keep bleeding into each other the longer you sit with them. A duel that decides a war against a duel that decides who someone actually is underneath their title. What this countdown has tried to hold on to, from the smallest scuffle over a stolen scroll to the platform Zuko and Katara stood on at the very end, is that this show almost never let a fight be only spectacle. Somebody was always deciding something about themselves in the middle of it, whether to trust, whether to forgive, whether to finally stop hiding what they actually are. And that is a harder thing to animate well than a good punch. And this show pulled it off, fight after fight, for 3 straight seasons, on a budget a fraction of what it would take today. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this much time in it with me tonight. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.